Hello, you awakening wonders. Thanks for joining me for today's fantastic show. It is going to be magnificent. Obviously, the entire conversation cannot be held here on YouTube if that's where you're watching it, because it becomes too powerful, too truthful. Remember, here on Rumble, what we're interested in is spreading not misinformation and disinformation, but truths that are challenging to centralized authority. There's a red button on your screen right now. Press it and join us on Locals. Become a member of our community so that I can see your comments and questions as they come up live. Today, our special guest is journalist, photographer, filmmaker and author Laura Dodsworth. We talked about her book, A State of Fear, how the UK government weaponized fear during the COVID-19 pandemic. But wherever you're watching this in the world, America, Canada, some nation in Africa, Latin America, Scandinavia, wherever, you will notice that your government, to varying degrees, use nudging, behavioralism, propaganda, and in some cases, downright lies. Allegedly, in order to control you. Obviously, we cover topics that we cannot discuss on YouTube. As you know, the WHO still got their sticky little fingers in that platform. So we'll be clicking over exclusively onto Rumble at around 15 minutes when I'll be asking some important questions about images from horror, downright propagandist lies, and all sorts of stuff. If you're watching this on YouTube, there's a link in the description. Watch us on Rumble. If you're watching us on Rumble, press the red button and join us on Locals. If you're watching us on Locals, come on over. Join us. Let's establish semi-permanent communities. Let's have a look at Laura.
The government operationalised a campaign to make everybody frightened.
Laura Dodsworth, writer, photographer and filmmaker.
She's written for the Sunday Times, the Telegraph and the Spectator.
A State of Fear.
Controversial book, A State of Fear.
Was it favourably reviewed by the mainstream media?
One of the worst book reviews known to man in the Times.
So what was covert, Laura?
To not mince our words, the government used fear to control you.
In order to make those people afraid, you have to deceive them.
In our time, and who'd have thought that we'd see it, we've seen the mass evocation of fear and propaganda to gain compliance.
I can never trust centralised authority again in any form.
The most basic of freedoms you took for granted are not real at all. If you don't want to turn off the TV, you have to watch it mindfully. You have to understand that it's not a one-way process. They're trying to influence you as much as entertain you.
I wonder if you have concerns about what the next steps will be.
Well, what's next is the story of humanity. It always has been, it always will be the same. People can be manipulated.
Stay free with Russell Brand. See it first on Rumble. Thanks very much for joining us to talk about this book, A State of Fear, which is a best-selling book, I understand, Laura.
It was on the Sunday Times bestseller list for 4 weeks.
Was it favourably reviewed by the mainstream media?
It's funny you should ask. Well, actually, it's had really great reviews. Before I launch into some of the bad reviews, I shouldn't just start off with doing my own book down, should I? It had great reviews. You know, Lord Sumption called it an important book. It had reviews in Telegraph and the European Journal of Psychotherapy, some great reviews. But the Sunday Times bestseller list didn't actually protect it from one of the worst book reviews known to man in the Times.
Objectively, one of the worst ever ones.
Well, maybe I'm not very objective as the author, but it wasn't a great review. Much mention was made of my previous work. There's one book where I photographed and interviewed 100 women about their vulvas, their vaginas, for an exploration of womanhood. And you might have read the review and think that in real life I'm followed around by a chorus of high-kicking vaginas. I'm never without my vaginas. It was a very kind of obvious attempt to demean me, to delegitimise my new book.
Mate, look here. We've got, this is a quote from the advisor on SPI-B. Do you know what that is, advisor on SPI-B? We're talking about like that nudge unit and all that type of stuff.
I know exactly what this is because this is somebody that I interviewed for my book. SPI-B is the Scientific Pandemic Influenza Group on Behaviours. They're a group of social scientists, behavioural psychologists, various social scientists, and what they do is give the government advice in times of emergency, such as a pandemic. And I interviewed several of them when I was researching my book, A State of Fear. And this one here broke cover, actually, to speak to me because he was so concerned about the way the government was using fear and behavioural psychology. I mean, to not mince our words, the government used fear to control you in lockdown.
That's fascinating, and in a sense, perhaps it's something that we would have anticipated and something that we can appreciate. Sometimes I try to approach the extraordinary events of the last couple of years in good faith, not to the denial of what is evident and plain, that there have been regulations, legislations and advantages that have been accrued through that period that appear to point to an agenda, but at least not to leap to conclusions. Perhaps you and I together, through the course of our conversation, can highlight a case for how the pandemic was a revealing period, how we learned about how power functions, how we learn about how propaganda operates, and how we are manipulated, how our behavior is affected by messaging. Starting with this quote, Laura, that we've just referred to: the way we've used fear is dystopian. We have a totalitarian government in respect to propaganda, but all governments engage with propaganda. The use of fear has definitely been ethically questionable. It's been like a weird experiment. Ultimately, it backfired because people became too scared. So there was an explicit intention to use fear. It's interesting to note that in the end, we're dealing with a basic palette of emotion: rage and fear and shame. And even when something feels secular, mechanical and bureaucratic, its resources are quite emotional and deep, and that obviously raises ethical questions. Do you think that there was an ethical breach in the way that this pandemic was handled? Do you think that they understood things that they didn't convey, and do you think that they highlighted aspects of the pandemic, or whether that's medically or socially, in order to pursue agenda that was not plain or explicit?
Wow, there's so much to pick up on there. But I'm going to go back to your first point, that you approach this with good faith. And I think that's really important, because when I wrote the book, there were a lot of people that just said to me, well, why? Why would the government use fear? As though it had to indicate that there was some evil conspiracy theory or agenda. You know, there may or may not be, but there's a very simple answer to the question. And that is that governments use fear because it encourages compliance. There is a gap between your rational thoughts and your suppressed emotions, and it's that gap that allows governments or any would-be manipulator to control you, to manipulate you, to exert undue influence on you. And fear is the steam in the emotional engine. Fear is the big one. Is it a breach of ethics to use fear? I think this really depends on where you sit personally and ideologically. I would probably put myself right at one end of the spectrum that says you should not use fear to control people. It is unethical. If this was a laboratory experiment, if a psychologist wanted to put their fingers in your brain, reach around and use fear to control you to see what happens, then they would need to go through an ethics approval procedure. You would sign a consent form. None of us signed consent forms at the beginning of the lockdown, did we? And what's more, at the end of the experiment, they would make sure that you left happy. You know, you would probably watch a rom-com and have a slice of chocolate cake. They wouldn't send you out a gibbering wreck with COVID anxiety syndrome. There was never any end to this. The advisors that I interviewed for A State of Fear, the ones who spoke to me on the record and those who spoke to me anonymously, I asked them all, what is the plan for de-escalating fear? And there was no, which is a form of behavioural psychology and propaganda, to shut down debate, legislation, disagreement, in fact, because these covert ways to influence you are successful and they bypass all that kind of procedure. So if you know, the COVID pandemic and the lockdown created what academics have called a window of malleability. Our habits changed, and that meant we were ripe for more change. You know, it's a great time then to push the idea of changing habits towards, say, net zero goals.
When you say covert, what covert modes were utilized? Do you think that the entire endeavour is to a degree covert because they were not explicit about their operation? It's obviously incredibly convenient that many of the things that were used to mobilise fear and compliance have subsequently been demonstrably untrue, whether that's the efficacy of the medication,
Allegedly.
or the origins of the virus,
Allegedly.
or many of the subsequent measures. So what was covert, Laura?
I think a lot of it is covert. You know, a pandemic is an emergency. But back in February 2020, World Health Organization documents showed that at that point, it was very well understood that COVID risk was stratified according to your age and your clinical status. So the elderly or people with particular comorbidities were more at risk. By March 2020, we locked down. And the government's obviously asked this panel, SPI-B, a question. Crikey, what are we going to do? We're going to lock down. We're going to mass quarantine the healthy. How are we going to make sure people follow this rule? Because it's unprecedented. I know from talking to these advisors, they were worried about things like, you know, the poor old working class chap missing football in the pub. You know, it's kind of classist assumptions going on here. And so SPI-B advisors reply with this whole gamut of suggestions. One is that people's sense of personal threat needed to be increased because they were complacent, because they understood the risk to their demographic group. Another way of looking at that is that people understood very well what the risk was. They understood the risk to their age. If I think back to that time, my mum started shielding long before they were supposed to. Yeah. She's in her 70s, she's got terminal lung conditions, she's poorly, her and her husband hold themselves up. I, on the other hand, was trying to finish a big photography project, and I thought, right, okay, you know, my work might be thrown off the table for a while. I'm off. I'm taking some hand sanitizer. I'm going to be careful. I'm not going to go into services. You know, we understood our risk. The SPI-B advisors never explained how they would only target the complacent or those at risk. No, what happened was the government operationalised a campaign to make everybody frightened. This isn't unheard of in public health problems. If you think back to AIDS in the 1980s, we were told that everybody would know someone that died of AIDS within 10 years. And that didn't happen. You know, that never came to pass. I don't know anyone, luckily, who died of AIDS. So there's a kind of a trend in public health to increase the sense of risk, to democratise the sense of risk, if you like. So to stop people being complacent, to increase their sense of risk, they did things like ads. You know, nearly £1 billion was spent across 11 government departments in the UK over 3 years, most of it on COVID. So many ads, some of them taking quite a horror film aesthetic. They were designed to make you feel that, you know, if your loved one died, it was your fault. You didn't follow the rules.
Let's have a look. Thank you, Laura. Sorry to interrupt you. Let's have a look at some of those ads. When it becomes, when in the event that people have correctly deduced that they are not at risk, then in order to elicit fear, you have to mislead them. So it's not only covert, it's duplicitous at that point. If people have correctly deduced, oh, I'm not really at risk, so I should go out, in order to make those people afraid, you have to deceive them. Let's have a look at some of these assets. These are obviously assets that are derived from the UK. Why don't you post in the chat some of the assets from your country? They won't regard them as assets, they will. You'll regard them as propaganda, quite rightly. So if you're in America or if you're in Canada, why don't you tell us the most egregious examples in your country? Show me what they were using in the US. Show me what they were using all around the world. Because that indicates that there was a degree of cohesion and collaboration transcendent of national sovereignty, which one might argue is appropriate during a pandemic, but possibly had more nefarious ends than, you know, the preservation of human life. In fact, Laura, one of the things that I continually queried is this seems at odds with how we organise society in other areas. It doesn't seem to me that, broadly speaking, the way we organise society is all life is sacred. We must protect everyone. That's why our economic systems, social justice systems are all reflecting this sanctity of human life. Elsewhere, it looks like elitism, control, opportunity for regulation, opportunity for profit are the mandates that drive the way the culture functions. So look at these. It's good that you mentioned the horror aesthetic. I know you did some work, mate, on the red and yellow thing there, like the sort of colours that were used. And we'll break down, like, sort of tell this one, see, telling the risk isn't real. What's extraordinary here is all of these require us to accept, and we might have to leave YouTube now, guys. We might have to leave YouTube. So there's a link in the description. Join us exclusively on Rumble.